Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well and safe. You're all most welcome to this fourth session in the Keeping the Dream Alive series by the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage, My Travel Research, and Low Season Traveller. I'd like to give a special welcome as well to all of our World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage members and supporters. Big shout out for you guys. Before we get started, a few general housekeeping rules. You're all on mute to avoid background noise, but please do feel free to use the chat function to let us know that you're here. Please do also send us any questions which you have from today's session via the questions function, which you should see on your GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll aim to get through as many as we possibly can. Just keep posting those questions up. All sessions will be recorded, and we'll send out links to the recordings shortly after each session, and we'll also release the Q&A from each session as a podcast on the Low Season Traveller Insider Guides podcast series, which you can find on iTunes, Spotify, the wetac.org website, the mytravel.com website, and of course Low Season Traveller website. You'll also find Q&A from John Kuldowski's session, I can tell you now, the one which we recorded on Tuesday, as well as every other session. So today's session is the fourth session in a series of 12, where we're hearing from global experts in the fields of marketing and communications, tourism data, aviation, hospitality, and more. So don't forget, please, to sign up for the whole series and share the links with your friends and industry colleagues. Finally, we can't provide any of these sessions without the kind support of all of the partners which you see on the screen below me or to the side of me, however you're looking at us. So special thanks to all of those guys. We really appreciate your support. So let me introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Jed Brown, and I'm the founder of Low Season Traveller and also the managing director in EMEA for the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage. And it's my honour to be your moderator for the entire series. As I mentioned before, this is our fourth episode, which is entitled Survive and Thrive, Marketing in the New Abnormal. And in the first session last week, we had Dr. David Berman, who provided us with an outstanding overview on what a crisis is and what the recovery tactics typically are. Then we had our second session last Thursday, where we heard from the WETAC president, Chris Flynn, on the lessons that we have, and in some cases haven't, learned from past crises facing our industry. In Tuesday's session, we had Professor John Kuldowski giving us the current position and outlook, and I think we were all a little bit surprised at the amount of optimism that came out of that session. So in this fourth session, we're going to be building on this positivity as we hear from one of the world's leading travel and tourism analysts and indeed marketeers. And so I am absolutely delighted and thrilled to introduce you to our keynote speaker for today. Carolyn Childs is the CEO and future strategist of mytravelresearch.com. Where she helps organizations to future-proof their businesses by using the secret superpower of evidence and big picture thinking. Carolyn has more than 30 years experience using intelligence and insight to advise her clients across the aviation, travel, and tourism sectors to help ensure that they can make better decisions. Having conducted projects in nearly 40 countries on pretty much every continent across all aspects of the travel industry, Carolyn's specialities include applying trends to your organization, branding, including destination branding, loyalty and consumer relationship management, customer relationship management, marketing strategy, communication strategy, new product development, multi-country research, cross-cultural communications and factors. And finally, Carolyn is the creator of mytravelresearch.com's 4 laws of trends and our 4-step apply trends framework. A very good morning to you, Carolyn, and welcome to the series, although you've been part of the series for the past 4 episodes so far, of course, as our producer as well. How are you doing this morning? This evening, I should say.
This afternoon, Jed. We'll be optimistic. Okay. We're still in the afternoon. Yes, and actually, I think there are probably people all around the world who are listening in now who are going, we didn't think it would take long, and we've surprised it would take till episode 4 before she couldn't resist being in front of the camera. So yes, here I am stepping out from behind the console into the front. Now, Jed has said some very nice things about me, and so did CEO and President of WETAC, Chris Flynn, when he was promoting this session. But one thing I want you always to think about, and it always makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable when that happens, is I know how much of the knowledge that I have is incremental and that it builds on one another. So what I would say to people is, if you feel that I have seen further than others, it's because I am standing on that, and I want you to take that own knowledge and belief into your practice about what you do today. That lesson is from the great Isaac Newton. It took 300 years before anyone managed to find new theories to surpass him. And the person who did, Albert Einstein, still revered what Newton said and recognized that way that we increment knowledge by sharing knowledge, by discussing, by having alternate viewpoints on things. Now, Jed touched on this, but as I said, what I like to think of my job as being, I've had my hair cut. Those of you looking at the photo going, oh, she looks very different there. This is not me, this is you. I see my job as to make you feel that you're making powerfully confident decisions based on evidence. I'm not here to do your job. A lot of today is about getting you to think about and use the frameworks to do this so that you can make decisions with confidence, because confidence is never been in shorter supply than right now. But my job is, your job is to do this. My job is to help you think about frameworks and ways that you can do that. So the title, when we were trying to think about this, I think what we're looking at is, one, beginning with survival and then driving through to thrive, and marketing in the new abnormal. For those of you who are like, kind of, there's a lot of normals around there now, and you're going, what the heck is she talking about? The new abnormal. I'm going to explain why I think it's very important that we understand the context that we're operating in. Then I'm going to talk about some of the unchanging wisdom that we have. I'm then going to say, how do we do marketing in the new abnormal? And we will be opening it up to questions. As Jed said, please share comments during the chat box, but please also post your questions. Chris Flynn, our President and CEO of WeTech, is actually sat there looking at and moderating all the questions behind the scenes for me today as we go through. So I think the reason, some of you may have picked up from some of the other webinars when we've been chatting at the end, I'm actually very uncomfortable with the phrase, the new normal. Because I think the problem with the new normal is that right now we are not in a new normal. Normal, when we talk about norms, norms are things that happen all the time or that are regularly occurring. There's nothing normal about where we are now. What it speaks to is an enormous part of the human ability to create normality in apparently chaotic and difficult situations. Don't get me wrong, that is a wonderful power. It has helped proceed, it has helped take us to be the first geological age that is named after a species rather than after geophysical resources. But I think we need to acknowledge instead that we are living in the age of the new abnormal, and we were already living in it even before COVID-19 hit. If anyone is ready and sitting there thinking they've heard that phrase before, if you know where that phrase is from, feel free to chuck it into the chat box and tell me where you think it's from. And I'm just going to pause while I give everyone a little moment to start doing that and entering it. I came across this phrase for a trends presentation I was doing for a big marketing summit here in Australia a couple of years ago. And the moment I read it, the hair stood up on the back of my neck, because I knew that this was an important and vital way to think about the way that we act and behave now. The source of the phrase is the scientists who set the doomsday clock. And they came up with it when they decided not to move. If you're not familiar with the doomsday clock, this is an assessment of how close we are to global Armageddon or the end of the world, by thinking of the end of the world as midnight, and how many minutes away from that is how close we are to the end of the world. And they put out an announcement that said, we're not moving the time frame. And what was quite interesting was all over the world, things go out, the doomsday clock is still, nothing's getting worse, this is all great news. And they were a little bit disturbed by this, because the doomsday clock at the point was standing at 3 minutes to midnight. For those of you who've studied history or like me, old, might realize that 3 minutes to midnight is where the clock stood during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we almost had nuclear annihilation, and during the peak of the new Cold War in the 1980s. So actually, we had normalized the idea that we lived in extraordinarily uncertain times. And it's no longer just about nuclear annihilation. It is about the fact that we're going to have increasing pandemics. It is about the fact that we have step change, climate change, that we have enormous biodiversity collapse. It's good for us now to be living in a space of discomfort, because discomfort will help us create the next normal. We aren't there yet. The next normal is McKinsey's phrase. That's where I first heard it. I like it because it's about the work that we do now. So this time is a precious time for us to do that. For a lot of people, I've used some big, scary words. So before we go any further, I would like us to think about H2G2, not COVID-19, not H1N1. Does anyone know what H2G2 is? Again, feel free to shout out and put some comments in the chat box or in the question box. H2G2 is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And what I think, one of the reasons I use Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quite a lot as an example is the front page of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is a travel guide after all, for those of us who are looking to travel just beyond Earth, but into the wider solar system. The first thing that it says on the front page, again, if anyone wants to stick something in the chat box, they certainly can do, is don't panic. So I've talked about some big, scary concepts. I've talked about living in this age of discomfort, of not being somewhere where we've reached a new normal. But that doesn't mean that everything has changed. It doesn't mean there are no lessons we can take from the past. We heard that from Chris Flynn this time last week. There are lots of lessons in marketing that we can take from what's happened in the past. There's a great deal that we can do to do that. But what we need to do is to work out how to apply those lessons critically. So we can't just import them and go, this worked 2 years ago or this worked 3 years ago. What we should be doing is saying, this has worked in the past. What about that situation means that it's relevant to this situation? So in talking about this and using some of those lessons, I think that we can do that. So here's some thoughts on that I prepared earlier. So the global financial crisis, our last major global recession, and don't we think nostalgically when the only thing we worried about was that recession would happen, that we weren't looking at recession and a pandemic. But globally, some academics, and looking through the Harvard Business Review, worked out that around 9% of 4,700 companies that they analysed came out of the recession in better shape. So first good news is someone did, but 91% of companies came out the same or worse. And they said, okay, what is it that makes those companies different? What was the way that they approached this? And I do think that this is an important thing to think about. And they talked about the idea of the Janus-like ability. So Janus was the Roman god of transition, so thresholds. It's who January is named after because it's the beginning of the year. He is a god that looks both ways. So they found that companies who did this had, to use the most overused word of the pandemic, pivoted, did so by doing two things. They were ruthless about what costs they could cut out of their business, but they were strategic about what they cut, but also what they didn't cut and what they did actually increase. And what we saw was that those 9% of companies grossly over-indexed on increasing their marketing. So what I would say the lesson we can learn from this is, at times like this, it is more important than ever to keep talking to customers. It's the how, the where, the what that needs to change. And the other thing I think that we've got, because we've now been looking at the evidence and assembling the evidence of this for a while, is that we actually have around a century's worth of evidence around the value of marketing in tough times. So 2003 was looking at the kind of last decades of recessions and looking back over that time. Add Value, BL, Alex and Stephen King looked at this and came to the conclusion that the companies who had market share growth, who grew their share of the market, were the ones who kept. Now they talk about advertising. I'm going to say I think this is about marketing, not solely about advertising. It's about connecting to customers with the things they want to hear. But interestingly, one of the very first studies of this is 100 years old. this year. So this was when Roland Vale looked at the use of advertising during a depression, which is what we're going to have. And I think what's significant about that was the analysis that he ran was of a pandemic, Spanish influenza, which honestly, if we think things are bad for us, the Spanish flu makes COVID-19 look like the teddy bear's picnic. So what we know is that people who increased their communication with customers, which meant traditional advertising in those days, but could mean many different things today, they were the companies who grow. The companies who emerged from the recession, who decreased advertising, came out of it worse and weaker and were less likely to survive. So we know that this is important. So, okay, a little bit more of things that we know have not changed. And in thinking about marketing, I would like you to meet two amazing pieces of marketing technology that are actually around about 50,000 or more years old. And that is the human brain and the human heart, which is actually what we're dealing with when we do with marketing. And the biomechanics of how human beings make decisions has really not changed that much. What's changed enormously is our understanding of those processes. I'm not saying that won't change in the future. Transhumanism is a major change. We could all be booking travel directly from our brains in about 5 years' time. But the biomechanics of how we react to things and why we buy things hasn't really changed since the first transactions of I will buy your club with my piece of flint. We actually still make the decisions in the same way. So there are lots of things that we can do with that. When we think about customers, I will say one thing I've noticed over many years for the travel and tourism industry is quite often we like to market to ourselves. What I want you to do is to take a clear-eyed view of who their customers are and whether or not they share your taste. In many cases, your business is set up because you love certain things and you find that that connects with customers. But do not assume that. Understand who your customers are because their tastes may not be the same. Now, I think in travel, we talk a lot about demographic frameworks. I'd like you to think that not all customers are the same, and demographics alone are not always the best predictor. If they've all you've got, use them, but I would encourage you to think about customers in multitude of different ways, and this is a demonstration. This is rather an old photo, but this is me on my left, possibly your right, and my sister Alison. Sat together waiting to go to a farmer's market in Sydney on an international VFR trip, which will be coming back. The thing about your family is that you don't choose them. You may all be very different. Really, the only differences between my sister and I are birth order. I'm the oldest, and the fact that she chose to have a family and then go to university later, and I went straight to university and skipped the family thing. But we're actually very different in our holiday tastes. And I've used the framework. Those of you who've listened to my webinars before know I really love the Destination Canada Explorer Quotient profiles. I've put us into those frameworks. So I kind of sit on the cusp between the Cultural Explorer and the Authentic Explorer. My sister Alison is a free spirit. What does that mean? So we're 15 months apart in age. If you market to us in the same way, you are not going to be converting us. It's going to depend which of us is planning the trip and whether we're traveling together. Again, not going to talk through all of the detail on this. This will all be in the slides, which we will share after you. But let's look at this. So I'm much more about spontaneity. I love surprises. I love uncertainty. I love complexity in what I'm doing. My sister loves consumption. She finds shopping. I am sitting there going, do we really have to go into another shop? Can we not go to a museum? Can we not go and climb a mountain? We have different tastes about that. So I'm accepting. I love, non-traditional stuff. She's much more fun-loving. She's very extroverted. She's the life and soul of every single party. Believe me, growing up with your younger sister like that is harder. So you then need to be thinking which of us should be targeting and thinking about the experience that we motivate. So there you see, number one for my sister. You don't have great shopping experiences, you're not getting her. For me, I want to be out observing and engaging with nature. I want to be going around and reading every single interpretive slide in a museum. And I want to be going out and doing lots and lots of fun stuff, water-based activities. I was actually out kayaking this morning. That's my social distancing exercise. And then we can start to think about what those needs might be for specific categories or types of experiences. So this is some work that we did with the luxury travel category about 4 or 5 years ago. And we used a framework that's built on a sound set of psychological principles going back again about 100 years to Carl Jung, but really that was brought to life by two Ogilvy ad planners, Mark and Pearson in the 70s, around two axes. So the extent to which you're an extrovert at the top versus an introvert, and the extent to which you are driven by the individual versus the collective. So individuals are your jet setters, over on the left your dynasts. We found that there are really 4 core needs these days in luxury travel: indulgence, empowerment, growth, and connection. And all of us will, I believe, have a home one of those. I'm very much an empowerment person, but different situations will mean that we are in different situations across that time. Traditional luxury was in the jet setter space and the lotus eater and the hedonism, but what's really powered the growth of the luxury sector is into areas like wellness, into culture and heritage, into philanthrotourism, into multi-generational travel, the dynasts. All of those are where the growth in there is. So you need to be thinking, who are you connecting to? And they're broadly quite similar in size as sectors. So don't try and target, if you're offering a really hedonistic experience, if you're offering that to an enrichment seeker, you're wasting your time. So be thinking about that. And I'm going to show you some ways to communicate with them later. The other big market that we think is very important using the same psychological framework is the area of domestic travel. We know that domestic is there. We're going to start with nanocations. We may even start, day trips will come first. Then we might stay overnight, not, a few hours drive away. Then we're going to spread out into our home destinations. And then beyond that, as borders open up, we will there. So firstly, I think this is an amazing time to put some glamour back into domestic travel, that it doesn't need to be the poor cousin. But secondly, this is some work that I did with my previous company, then came out, bought the research because I loved it so much so that I could share it with clients, where we looked at what are the motivations for domestic tourism. Now, at the heart of all domestic tourism is reconnection to place, reconnection to the people we care about, and reconnection to ourselves. But different experiences, different people have different needs from that. So some of us might do it through experience. We might want to go out and challenge ourselves. So that might be doing, one of the great walks of Australia here. But the other side of it might just going out and simple things, ice cream by the beach, fish and chips with the seagulls swooping around you might be that type of experience. So there is somewhere for every experience to do this, and you can find and connect to customers by using that language and identifying customers who care about that through your social channels, looking at language, through who responds to your website. All of those things are things that you can do to drive that forward. So really, really thinking about that. Now, as I said, this framework was created for Australia, but I believe that there are lots of lessons that certainly would apply in every Anglophone market, but I think for domestic travel, all of these need states would have approximate similarities for domestic travel all over the world. The other thing to think about, sorry, there's rather a lot of me in here, but I thought it would make it fun and help you get to know me a little bit. Remember that occasions can make a difference. So on one side, you have my milestone family celebration. This was my mother's 80th birthday, and we went on a short break cruise. It was not the kind of, my idea of a cruise would be Antarctica or on a Turkish Gouliet. That's not going to work for my mom. She's diabetic. It was about being together as a family and about doing things. So you can see, we went to the gala dinner, we all got dressed up. So that's who I am there. But similarly, once a year, I have a ritual weekend away with friends. So about 20 of us go away. The golfers go golf. The rest of us go and do other things, which are, in my view, much more fun. Like we go, this is us at the Hunter Valley Music Festival, consuming local wine and food and listening to live music while we're there. So this is me with my friends. So I'm going to have a different aspect of my personality. So can you find the occasions that your business are and target and talk about those occasions, layering it with, is it an adventurous ritual weekend away? So is it a skiing weekend? Is it, a food and wine, a music festival? Is it a culture weekend? think about how you are using those occasions to make a difference. The final thing, particularly for small businesses, that I like to do that I think will really help you with nuancing your tone of voice is don't think about demographics, speak to a person. It's much easier to talk to me, and this is a little bit why I've also used myself as an example. It's much easier to talk to me. So I've included a framework that we use in some of our marketing plans with clients, particularly with small businesses. And to think about and understand your client and to create a person and give that person a name. And then if you're trying to think, how do I communicate differently to them now, you start thinking about their current mindset and starting to overlay that and think about who they are. Again, I've used myself as an example to populate this. So, have a picture in there, because a picture brings that person alive. So when you're writing blog pieces or electronic mail or even an advertisement or a social media post, if you're writing to me, you're going to make it feel much more personal and genuine. So this is me on a World Heritage Site in Ethiopia, popping from hell, which is a long dark corridor with no lights, where you're not even allowed to have a light, into heaven, which is the sunlit uplifts of a small church. So my goals and values, you can see I love to help people. I probably recognized by now, I am a little neuroatypical, but actually I'm quite proud of that. But I do want to help destinations. I do want to balance this, and I do care about those issues that are going to be with us when we go away from this. So I want to know that I'm welcome, and I don't really want to go somewhere where it's all mass market. If you use this, you can also think about, how do you connect with me? I'm a news junkie, so if you've got the budget and you can buy advertising or display advertising to connect to me, on the BBC News site, you're going to find me. I'm signed up for 1 million emails and letters. But I also work in the industry, so can we market to each other? I ask myself. So hopefully I've given you some ways and some frameworks to think about customers. The next thing I want you to think about is one of the most understated and undervalued aspects of marketing, which is consistency. We all love the shiny new ad campaign, the shiny new social influencer. But one of the things that, as I said, our 50,000-year-old marketing technology of the human brain is that there is a neuroscience to communicating consistently, which is, if you want people to understand who you really are, if you talk to them consistently, you use the same language patterns, you use things, you can actually get them to have in their brain exactly the same idea. So this is a TED talk by Yuri Hassan. I do encourage you to go and listen to it. It's absolutely fascinating. So that you can actually, by consistently using your customer's understanding and your brand positioning, you can actually get your customer to model that in your brain. And even more fun, so they played this game where they played an episode of the BBC drama Sherlock. They got someone to watch it and to listen to that and recall it, and then they got him to tell someone about it. So not only did he have the messages that Sherlock writers had in their brain, he was able to reproduce that, and the person he told about it heard the same thing. And interestingly, because of the way we use language, it can actually even work if you don't understand the language that this person is speaking. So the more consistently you communicate, the more consistently your message will be understood and get cut through. And that's important for two areas. And how do you do that? So why should someone choose you above others? One example of this, 11,400 beaches in Australia. I'd honestly say probably 11,299 of those are absolutely bloody gorgeous. So how am I coming to your beach? And that's where having your brand and your brand consistently understood and frameworked and internalized by you is really important, because it creates that meaning for consumers. We know the evidence that brands who have that meaningful, they grow faster, they can charge more money, and just as important right now, they are resilient in times of crisis. So that's very important. And what it does is it removes the barriers to selection. Again, very important at the moment. They're more certain and it's good. You don't always have to be the best. It's just that people have to be more confident. But the second thing is, the number one way that consumers all around the world find information at every stage of their customer journey is through search. consistent language, consistent terms, consistent branding is one of the most effective ways to rank effectively in SEO. Now, Google updates their algorithms all the time, but all of the time that is to get a closer and better understanding of your brand. So the more consistently you talk about your brand, the more likely you are to be found. We need to be internally consistent, but what we need to also do is to stand out in a sea of sameness. I've done many focus groups and exercises with consumers where we put out a series of destination brand ads and we cover up the name of the company. And absolutely no one can tell you which beautiful beach, whether your beach is in Queensland or Fiji, most of the time. Unless there are some other cues like who's in the background, people cannot tell. So we need to find ways for us to stand out, because the eye is drawn, the brain is drawn to difference. No one is looking at the dozens of beautiful red roses. They are all looking at that white rose. So that's what you need to be doing. And we can use that same framework that we use to think about customers and the experiences to think about the experiences that we had. So this was an exercise that we did with the western half of New South Wales, the inland bits away from the sea. And we actually position some of their events. They have an amazing, if you come out in January, when you're able to travel again, go to the Elvis Festival. It is hilarious and awesome. We looked at the different worlds that we could show people. New England is, for those Americans listening, we have a New England in Australia as well. So we looked at where those things and those positions and experiences, so that the Southern Highlands sub-region knew that they had to use a different language to talk about their experiences from outback New South Wales. So they used that language and that framework to talk about their experiences, to showcase their experiences, and to do that. And I think that's really important. The other thing that we now know, because we've got a lot more data to play with, is the importance of our brand assets. Now, our logos, our images, our strap lines are not our brand, but they are assets of our brand that if we use them, they can build distinctiveness and they can help us, so that when I look at that ad of a beach or whatever, or a forest, or a waterfall, I know who you are and what you have to offer. And I've put up some that I hope, if anyone is seeing some and think, I don't know what they are, I've tried to pick global brands so that they will work all around the world. You can look at these ads and you no longer need the name of the company, because so consistently have they used them. And once you've done that, you can actually start to play with your brand code. So McDonald's did a whole series of things with social distancing. They took the golden arches and they separated the two M's, but you could still tell it was a McDonald's ad. So use your brand assets consistently until you've got enough recognition that then they create distinctiveness. MasterCard actually took the word MasterCard off those two red circles because they now want to do that, and they believe that talks about their brand values without them needing to use their name. And that's important, because if you don't do that in that sea of sameness, so this is some work that Havas did in their Meaningful Brands Index with around 35,000 consumers all around the world. 77% of consumers would not care if the majority of brands disappeared. So 3/4 of brands could go and no one would care, apart from the people who work for those brands. You obsess about your brand. Most customers don't care. You have to create meaning for them if you're going to be in that 23% of brands that customers are going, if this brand disappeared, it would matter in my life. So you need to be creating that content. If you're still going, really? I thought you'd be telling me I need to put my ad on Facebook and how that works. There's lots of guides for that. You can Google that. I want you to be thinking about these things that will help you build meaningful and long-term advantage. 100% Pure New Zealand, one of the world's most successful brand and destination campaigns, became so successful everyone assumed it was a country brand and applied to everything else. And about 10 years on from when they did it, they went back and said, did it actually work? So 100 years on from the start of the Pure New Zealand, they went back and they looked at their visitor numbers and said, look, did it drive a growth in visitor numbers? And you can see absolutely there was a growth in visitor numbers. But what they did also check, and it's important to do this, is they checked their growth rates against the growth rates of other destinations. And what they saw was that their branding had helped them get approximately a 6 to 8 percentage point advantage over other less well-branded destinations in terms of driving those IVAs that John talked about. Now, obviously, we know there's more to this than arrivals. New Zealand actually a few years ago risked being a victim of being too successful, but it proves that in our category, branding and that voice that you use, and I love the way they've evolved this brand into the, you know, the welcome that they do now, 100% pure welcome, first of the day. They have used the equity they had in that brand to play with it. What content creates meaning? So this is again from the Meaningful Brand Study. What's important, what people are looking for is different for different categories. And it's interesting because in travel, we tend to think a lot of it's about inspiration. We're the number three category in terms of brand categories that create meaning for consumers, but we're not very good at it at a big brand level. Booking.com is the only brand in the top 10 meaningful brands for consumers that's a travel brand. Then I think you've got number 20, you actually get one of the hotel brands come in. Inspiring is important, it's in the top 3, but being helpful and rewarding. So think about, particularly on your website, creating clear signposts to things that reward consumers. So make them feel smart, recognize customers who are coming back, retargeting them, directing them to places, providing helpful content. It's a big decision to travel and it's never been bigger. So you need to be doing that. And then make sure you've got your inspiration, use your hero images to do that type of thing. So it's really, really important. When you are marketing, choose the channels that work best for the part of the customer journey that you're trying to influence. So this is some great work that Missing Link, which is one of Australia's top 10 small social media agencies, has done. Really, really smart thinking. Remember, 90% of customers don't know about you, don't care about you, don't know that you're the solution to their problem. Only 7% are even thinking about you anytime. So you've got to be building that 90% so that when people start to be in that 7%, you've got some hooks to hang on. And you use different channels at different places. A couple of things are missing here. I think when you're trying to drive people into actually transacting, into buying from you, I think reviews that sit there for me in travel. The other thing I would say that cuts across all of this, underestimated your owned media. It's not, you should not be moving away from having a website. A website, more than ever, is your virtual shop front. And we now know how important virtual shop fronts are. Okay, so where are we now? So we've talked a little bit about the customer. We've talked a little bit about you and your brand. What's the conversation we should be having now? And this is some fabulous content. I don't know how many of you know TravelSat, the Travel Consumer Index. So this is an index of positive or negative sentiment towards taking travel. It's not the same as booking, but it does there's a very strong correlation, obviously, between starting to think about it, starting to look at it. Now, you know, at the beginning of the year, this is global. You know, we did see pretty high levels of that coming out of that. We know that that's peak booking season for much of the year. We saw it starting to come down as, you know, news about COVID began to really be something other than this funny virus that we're hearing about in China. We saw the world starting to shut down. We saw Wuhan shut down. We saw countries like Italy start to get affected. We saw it fall off the kind of cliffs that we saw in the visitor numbers that John talked about on Tuesday. We saw negative sentiment towards travel but interestingly, for less than 2 weeks. So basically between the 9th of March and the 23rd of March, we saw negative sentiment, and we've seen it steeply climbing back up. We're starting to think about travel again. And in fact, we're almost back at the point that we were before the big shutdown, before the scary numbers internationally started to show up. So a bit more evidence we're thinking about travel. We did some work here looking at whether people would travel after the bushfires, and we then had to do our own pivot to talk about this. 43% of Australians at the end of March were looking at traveling again. 70% of Americans, you know, in the middle of the worst, highest casualties, are looking at it. At the peak of the disaster in Italy, people were locked in their homes, dreaming of being somewhere else. 40% of us Italians at the peak of that were searching for trips in Q3 2020, according to Forward Keys and the European Tourist Commission, who are looking at that data for us. John used this chart in his session on Tuesday, but I liked it so much I bought the company. That's another example of a brand asset being used here. So what I wanted to say here is some people, again, all consumers are different. Some people are locked down. Some people are cutting back. Some people are saving to spend. We're going to emerge. About half of people are just want to get back to normal, or are actually thinking, I might spend more. So you need to be thinking about who those customers are and how you're engaging with them. And I'm going to deep dive into that, get back to normal and cautiously extravagant. I apologize that this is a little hard to read, but I couldn't get the sizing to work anyway. So one of the questions Ernst & Young in their study asked people in those various segments was, okay, how many of you are expecting to spend more and on what when this is over? Number 1 and 2 categories, activities and leisure and vacations and holidays, are the top 2 areas that half the market is saying I am going to spend more on. But look at the difference between the people in this get back to normal phase versus the people who are stockpiling some money because they're not spending. You know, 75% of them are going to be spending more on travel versus just under 10%, 75% on travel versus just over 10% on travel and just under 10% on activities and leisure versus 77-78%. So this is why I do not like the new normal, because new normal is these people. Next normal is who you need to be targeting here. And you also need to be thinking about this. So Ernst & Young also asked people, what will change as a result of COVID-19? Number 1, the way I travel will change. And that's true for more than a quarter of the people who are traveling normally, and nearly half of those cautiously extravagant. So this is where understanding the mindset and communicating to your customers with your brand in this mindset is so important to do that. You've got to get that tone of voice right. So looking at me as an example, I'm desperate to be traveling again. Believe me, I never wasn't. I know it's going to be domestic first. I actually live in Australia, so I'm very lucky. I'm looking for amazing things to do, but also a bit of indulgence. My number 1 trip's probably going to be to the Adelaide Hills. The Adelaide Hills was badly affected in the traumatic bushfires in January. So I want to know the stories. I want to see both sides of that. I want to see stories of resilience, and I want to know that I'm helping. As an industry professional, as I said, I think we've got an amazing opportunity to reframe domestic travel, and I want my trips to be part of that. I am ready to book now, as long as I know that if the government extends the lockdown periods, I'm not going to lose my money, because I'm not going to get anything back. So I am ready to book if I cannot do it. So can you find, not me, but can you think about who those customers are and what those messages are for them? It's important not only to fall into the mindset trap. So this is, I recommend you to have a look at these ads. This is a series of ads that are around balancing the brand with the consumer mindset. And this is a series of ads that all look exactly the same. Cover up the name, and I bet you'll only be able to guess one of those ads, and that's for FedEx, and that's because there's a bloody great FedEx plane in the picture, and if you can't work out it's for FedEx, you've got problems. So you need to make sure that you talk about the consumer mindset and you do it in conjunction with your brand. Find your own unique voice. So this is from the global financial crisis. This was a hotel group who basically took on the recession. They said, we are not going to give in to the recession. We're about living life non-stop. So I want you to look at the language here. They actually used an obscenity in English. I'm not going to use it because I know we have lots of cultural sensitivity on the line. But they actually said, but we're going to have a party. Now, obviously, can't have parties during COVID-19, but how can you bring that language of rebellion, of fighting back into your communication if you are that type of brand? Responding to that is going to respond to the mindset of the customers that appeal to you. Now, this is a COVID-19 ad from Dove. Lots of ads with health workers. These ads are different. This ad is a Courage is Beautiful ad, and it shows the faces of health workers when they come off duty and they take their PPE off. I can't even talk about this ad without getting excited because I get so emotional. It's a brilliant ad. Their faces are tired. You've got the marks of their masks on their faces. But Dove is celebrating the beauty of who they are. And that is very on mindset, but it's also brilliantly linked to everything that Dove is about, which is about true beauty coming from within and finding your own beauty. So it's a beautifully modulated campaign to do that, which incidentally got shared in the healthcare press. So great content is going to get shared and reach customers who are resonant to that, who are going to care and share that somebody cared about them, didn't just use them as a prop in their ad. Again, using those same kind of frameworks. I was brainwashed in this framework when I worked for TNS Kantar. Our Morgan hotels are our soldiers. We are going to fight. We are going to fight back for that. Our Dove is a nurturer. So which of these are your brand? And which of these is going to respond? Which of these is going to be how your customer responds? And that is the language that you need to be using, and the content and the imagery that you need to be using. It's important to have a plan because, as I said, we're living in the new abnormal. It's going to change non-stop. So definitely getting to do that. Now, this is Tourism Australia's plan. This links back to what David showed you in the first webinar. I think the thing that's missing from this is what's going to impact on us from economic capacity and uncertainty around the economy. So I think we'll need to start building that in, but have a plan and accept it's going to change. The mindset of consumers a little bit more on that. We know that there's a cycle of trends where we come out of a period of war or downturn and we seek security and stability, which is our stabilized fund. Then we start to come out of that. We want to seek change. That change, we seek back control. And then finally, we go into a hedonistic phase of escape. Now, prior to COVID-19, we were moving into this space. The Occupy movement, the climate strikes, all of those things, we were there. We probably can expect to be back here because of the economic downturn and what was happening there. And that's because if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we were up here, which tends to drive the behaviors at this point. We're now back down here: safety, security, physiological needs. So we need to be thinking about that. And the other thing is, it's the difference between the individual in franchise escape or individualistic spaces, stabilize and transform our collective spaces. So we're going back into that. So it's going to be about speaking with authority, with knowledge, with giving people certainty. So you need to be bringing that through. To do that yourselves, you need to scenario plan. So one plan, but lots of backup plans. So I've given you some examples of those. I'm going to click through so we've got time to questions. The one on the right is from Kantar. It's one that they've been using. Again, they've looked at the response in terms of two axes, which is how we respond to the virus versus what happens if the virus is a one-off versus it keeps coming back, which I think we know it will do. Again, I think we need a third dimension to this, and I'm working on a third dimension at the moment to say, how do we bring that economic uncertainty and that economic recovery into this? But having scenario plans, having more than one plan, and working when to switch between them is going to be how you move from surviving to thriving. So you don't keep doing things that aren't getting you results. It is absolutely okay to sell right now. We are moving into that travel frame. But again, remember that path to purchase. Where are the channels? Do not be doing selling in these channels. These channels are your inspiration and your relationship building channels. These are your relationship building channels as well. These are the channels to transact. Using EDMs, using SEO, using paid search targeting, bringing people back, looking for lookalikes to your existing customer base. And as I say, I think your website is a very under-recognized asset. We are ready to book. Remember me, I'm ready to book, but I do not want to be caught out with thousands of dollars with you when it could be with me if things change. This is a campaign P&O use even in good times. This is a phrase to send shivers down the spine of people in Australia. So Ruby Princess, the cruise ship that is responsible for about 1 in 7 infections in Australia, is actually, well, actually 1 in 7 deaths, is actually already booked out for the first quarter of next year. So if you create commitments, something that we have committed to is 3 times as valuable to us as something that we haven't committed to. So even $1 is going to bring you sale, but remember to offer people that flexibility to come away. Embrace this time of the new abnormal to change. I still see businesses out there where I can't transact on their website. You know, even 95-year-old grannies, even Captain Tom, who raised 27 odd million for the NHS, did so on a crowdfunding page. So if you cannot transact digitally, you will not survive, never mind thrive. And to move from survive to thrive, you cannot just be doing activation. So it is okay to sell, but you need to be doing brand building if you want to thrive in the long term. We've got decades worth of evidence for this. We need to be spending probably about 60% of our money on the long term and 40% on the ROI measurable stuff now. So really, I reckon you need to be looking in those frameworks. And if you're not doing that, you will just come out of the current, you might emerge from the current situation, but you will always be chasing your tail for the next 2-3 years till things settle down. So thriving in the new abnormal, please start getting your questions ready. I can see they're popping through, so Chris will be joining us in the moment. Understand your consumer. If you can afford to do so beyond the demos. Consistently communicate your point of difference. Use your assets to build distinctiveness. Think about those 3 pillars I've talked about: the consumer, the brand, and the environment. Because the only new normal is the next abnormal, is the new next normal. And that is the one that you are going to create as you do this. To survive, you will need to be flexible. To thrive, you will need to be agile, which is a harder and bigger thing. So I do hope we've got some questions to go for. I'm going to go to the question and answers and call Jed and Chris back onto the screen to take us through this. Chris, Jed, where do we
Carolyn.
start?
Carolyn, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. There was just a huge amount of information in there. It felt like it was an MBA, an MBA in marketing in an hour. Absolutely incredible, and thank you so much for that. We've actually had quite a lot of questions, but there's one that I'd just like to go to straight away, which is a question from Sean, which I thought was a really interesting one. And his question is this: companies that need to come out better off need to take the hard decisions. Many companies are laying off staff right now, but study also shows from your presentation that for the brands to come out better off, they need to increase their marketing spend. Carolyn, what is your perspective when a brand lays off staff and then spends more money on marketing? Does this impact the brand negatively in any way? Does it affect the goodwill factor?
Yes, it does, and it's an enormously hard balancing act. And I never want to underestimate how hard some of the decisions are about doing this. So I think there's a couple of things. It's about communication. So when you're laying off staff and you're explaining to them that you have to do this, you have to be framing it around why you're doing that, and you have to be honest and transparent about that. And you also have, just as not even more importantly, to be actually communicating with people who are your existing staff, because one of the things we know is that there's huge survivor guilt from the staff who survive downturns. So you have to be explaining to them that this is about securing as many of those jobs as you can, and about why that is the reason you've had to spend your money that way right now. In those countries where you've got job seeker allowances, as we have in Australia, as I know, Jed, you have in the UK, that's where you're using those tools and you're saying we're keeping as many people as we can, but if we don't have customers coming in, you have to be really honest. And I think it's okay to show your pain and show how hard this is for you. But I'm never going to underestimate that. And I think the other thing is you have to have a bloody great PR strategy for when that comes out. So some disgruntled staff member is laid off, understandably heartbroken, looking at paying their mortgage. They're going to go and say, well, why are you launching this ad campaign? And you need to be very clear about this as a job-saving device.
It kind of links with I think it was either John Kuldowski or it might have been Dr. David Bierman, where he was saying about the sensitivity of handling those layoffs is just so critical. And I don't know what yourself have sort of heard, Carolyn, over recent weeks, or what any of our listeners and audience have heard, but I've heard certainly quite a few experiences where it just hasn't been handled very well by the organization. You know, they've done it at practically a whim. They've done it relatively insensitively. And it's you know, I think that's probably going to be an effect, or have an effect on those brands and organizations as well, right?
Absolutely. If you think about how you let staff go as being part of your marketing, and what that message and what the optics of that are, it will help you. I have a theory that one of the reasons people are so bad at laying off staff is because we feel so bad, and we get rid of the bad feeling in us. We're not thinking about that empathy for the person on the other side. Well, we are, but we don't express it that way. And often this is also where that balance of what you can say legally versus what you can't say comes in. So this is where I think you really need to plan it well. And I mean, I would be honest and say we have another speaker coming up in the series from Tourism Talent, who is going to probably address this better than I could in terms of the how to do that. But if you remember that big part of how your brand is going to be is how you manage the shit stuff, if you'll forgive my language.
Yep.
That's why managers get paid the big bucks. We don't get paid the big bucks for when times are good. We get paid it for when you have to look at someone in the face who you respect, who is a talented staff member, and let them go.
Yeah. Great, very great, great question there, Sean. Thank you for that. Other questions that we've got coming in. If you have worked 100,
I've got a question.
Oh, sorry. Go on, Chris.
Yeah. I'm quite interested. I was interested in the sentiment trending upwards and turning that curve fairly quickly. How can you turn that into action in a depressed environment? What would be your advice for that?
Well, I think the first thing, Chris, is to be aware that it's there. And to be keeping an eye out, and there's lots of stuff in the press at the moment talking about this, so there's absolutely heaps of information out there. If you've got a marketing department, get them to be watching that. I think, again, it's really about balancing that and looking at it and saying, you know, the early stages of that were really that thing that you saw with Tourism Australia, where they were, you know, feeding that with content, with messages, with kind of emotive stuff, but always doing it through the framework of their own work. So I think David showed their campaign in his session in the first of the series. So they were using their locations, but they were using an energy about this. They were using an Australian philosophy to draw on, which is, you know, I always say Australia is a country for people who like dealing with crises, because, you know, we do have bushfires, we have immense variations in our weather cycle. We also incidentally have immense variations in our exchange rate. It's a hideous place to run a business in some ways from that point of view. So I think you know, that idea of the resilience of the Australian character was something that they really tapped into for that. And that idea of we're coming back, we're going to be back, but here's something to be looking at. So, you know, we've seen a lot of pictures of a lot of stories around the animals around there. So the one that really went, I mean, it's a specifically Australian example, but what I would always encourage people to say is what's your equivalent of the koalas at Port Macquarie Hospital? So some of the koalas that were put at, were made homeless or were injured during the Australian bushfires earlier this year. Port Macquarie Koala Hospital, if you ever come to Australia, go to Port Macquarie Koala Hospital. It's awesome. They shot some video of the volunteers releasing the recovered koalas back into the wild. Now we know our koalas are an absolute fast track to every human being's amygdala. They deal with our reptile brain of emotion. We want to bond, we want to connect. But it's told a story of hope and resilience in a uniquely Australian way. So, you know, I could see we had some people, you know, what would a story of resilience and a unique story of hope in a uniquely Malaysian way or a uniquely adventure tourism way be? You know, is it walking up mountains? So I think it's how can you do that and how can you leverage that in those different stages of the plan. And that's why the plan is so important, Chris. And when the consumer mindset gets to here, this is what messages we're going to, how will we know we've got there? That's what TA know. what messages do we need to put out there, and what channels do we need to put them in? And that's how you operationalize that, is you have a plan. And if you see a second outbreak come out, which I think we will see second outbreaks, how are you pivoting to deal with that? How are you pivoting if the consumer mindset goes up and then suddenly they see another outbreak and it kind of pivots back down? What's your plan? So plans in that kind of detail with backup plans are your friend in the new abnormal.
Another question, great question here from Berendian Lube. Forgive me if I've pronounced your name incorrectly, Berendian. What about if you were just about to launch a new product and were interrupted through lockdown? What would the best marketing strategy be, given it is an unknown product, new company, unknown brand? Product may be regarded as green.
By green, we mean environmental, I'm guessing.
I'm guessing so, yeah.
I'm going to be a bit cautious about answering that question, Jed, because I don't know enough about the product to know how it connects to the mindset. But I think the principles I've talked about here is I'd get everyone on a Zoom or a GoToWebinar call in your marketing team, get that evidence together and understand, are we ready yet? And if we, is the consumer mindset ready? Is it gonna clang? When is that point? And again, it's probably going to sound a little bit repetitive, but I would be filling those buckets of information, because what I tried to do today was not say go away and do this. What I tried to say is these are the buckets that you need to fill in your marketing. The bucket of where's the consumer mindset? Well, the bucket of who's the consumer and what motivates them. The bucket of where the mindset is, and the bucket of, who are we and what are we? Now, I would probably say for a green product, if you are able to pivot very quickly, one point to launch that might have been when we started to see the bottom of the canals in Venice, or we saw communities that saw the Himalayas for the first time. So if your product was something that was engaging you to take something to that place, for example, I would be having those moments. This is what I mean by being truly agile. That if you saw something that brought that out, that you saw something that was coming out, that you could tie it to, when you come back, we'll be ready to take you to see the Himalayas. And we'll be the company to do that because of this. If one of those occasions doesn't occur for your product, I honestly think it's a matter of short-term timing for anything that's an environmentally sustainable product, because all of the issues that existed before we had COVID-19 are going to be there. We have 10 years to save the planet. And that's going to be helped a little bit by COVID-19. Ironically, Mother Nature has said, look, go back to the drawing board of it, guys. But that reality, that existential threat that is one of those ticking minutes on the doomsday clock is not there. So that moment when people are back out and starting to pivot to the next normal, to me, would be trying to find, if you haven't found that opportunistic tactical moment before that, that would be the moment to do it.
Fantastic. Thank you for the question, Berendian.
Actually, just before you move on, I'd just like to welcome Berendian. She's one of our new members from Pretoria University. So shout out to you, Berendian, and it's great to have you with us as part of our family. So thank you.
Fantastic. Another question linked to that one. This is from Lynn Hocking. If you've worked 100% in the past with international clients, and now you need to reprice and maybe redesign products for domestic, what are the challenges that go along with that? And also, it was kind of in follow-up, how about deposit-free bookings, which I guess links to the example you gave there for P&O, which I suppose is altogether, it's linked with the issue of trust, isn't it? Is that one of the biggest, wider issues that we've got as a result of this within the industry, that there's been some kind of an erosion of trust that we've had?
I think there's an erosion of trust. I wouldn't actually say a deposit free. What I like about the $1 is that there is something committed to that. So what I think you want to do in this situation is you get the customer to commit to you but what you say in return is you leave them that freedom to walk away, that flexibility. So I think I wouldn't be in favor of no deposit. I would be in favor of a small incremental deposit, an amount of money that maybe you can put to something. So P&O use $1, because who is really, among people who are likely to cruise after this, who is not got $1? And you've captured their details, you've got that commitment. The reason P&O is able to do that is because they know that the vast majority of people who do that are going to go on and book and put down money later on. So I think if you've got that little bit firmer commitment, the level of loss aversion, that 3-time ratio, is going to be greater. If you are doing domestic, I think, as I said, what I would be looking at is looking at the idea of how can you create that excitement from reconnection, and how can you understand the domestic consumer, because it is a little bit different. I know Lynn personally, so I know that she's based in Australia. I'm going to use Australia as an example. We know that Australians, as I mentioned when we were talking to John and David earlier, they're the most demanding consumers on the planet, and they're some of I wouldn't say they're tight with their money, but they expect a lot for their money. So I would say that that's something that you can do. The other thought I had, and this comes back to the very first Domesticate study, which was a study of the domestic tourism mindset in Australia that I worked on in 2006. Does anyone remember having a granny who had one of those piggy banks that said money for rent, money for electricity, money for gas? I can hear you laughing, Jed, so I know you do.
Yeah.
And people said, we'd like one of those. So could you create some money boxes for your clients? Could you create a virtual money box on your digital site, which is a savings bank? All of the banks do this. In Australia, the Commonwealth Bank has this thing where they sign kids up and you get a piggy bank. I can't, given that we don't change banks very easily, I can't tell you how much money that has generated for Commonwealth Bank, because you're creating that thing that you've got that commitment, but you've also helping them, that be helpful moment. So I'd be saying, what if you were to say to people, why don't you have a savings? Why couldn't you open a savings account for them? A joint savings account.
Yeah.
Could you do something like that? Could you create that virtual slot money box where they're putting money in? The only way I would say, I wouldn't say do it as no charge deposit. The other way I would do it as a redundancy deposit. And the cruise industry did this during the last crisis in the USA. So they said to people, if you have a job now and you can prove to us you have a job, and you put down a deposit or you pay for your holiday, if you lose your job, and again, you need to provide us evidence, it will be 100% money back, no questions asked.
I love that.
I love it too. It's super smart. Yeah. Because
it's interesting. We during the hard times that we've had, I'm sure everybody in our audience has had hard times, from a personal point of view as well as from a business point of view. But during the personal times when we've had hardship in the past, when myself or my wife might have been out of work, we've actually had, like you say, we've had little envelopes. And there's little envelopes where we actually fill the cash in. So we get the cash at the beginning of the month, and we used to put, this is the cash for the electricity bill, this is the food shopping, this is for petrol. And it just helps you to kind of understand a little bit more visually your budget. And I think something like that, to be able to do that for clients, like you say, to have a virtual piggy bank, I think that's just a wonderful idea. I could see that really taking off.
That's focus groups for you. They still have a role, Jed. But as I say, I think it is that. But it's also, it does two things. One, it helps you do that budget, but two, it gives you hope. Because I bet you I know which of those envelopes you most enjoy putting money in.
Oh yeah.
And no, it's not a bad time. But my dream trip is still to go to Antarctica. And anyone who's looked at going to Antarctica knows this is it's a trip of a lifetime, and it's an investment of a lifetime. We actually have a savings account that it's called the Antarctica Fund. So I think that's where, what I really liked about the cruise example that I gave you is anyone who was questioning that was going to put it down. Now, in actual fact, 95% of the people who put down a deposit under that deal would not have lost their jobs. 5% might, and what we know informally, qualitatively, I've heard from some of the cruise companies is, 40% of those people actually spent some of their redundancy money taking the cruise anyway, because you needed a holiday if you just lost your job. But the point is, you had 95% of those bookings. If you hadn't taken those bookings, they would have sat there and gone into distressed inventory. It's a heck of a lot harder and a heck of a lot less profitable to shift distressed inventory. Often people talk a lot about I'm giving something away. You're not giving something away if the customer's not going to give you their money for it anyway.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's right.
I want to get through. We've got loads of questions, so I've got to crack on, Carolyn. Good question here from Tony Hallwood. Good morning to you, Tony. Carolyn, do you believe that the ineffective manner in which the British government has dealt with the COVID-19 impact has tarnished the image and reputation on the UK travel industry? I see the Sydney Daily Herald today is highlighting the way in which the UK responded to the virus. Has this delivered long-term damage to the UK inbound tourism market?
Okay, as an England cricket supporter who lives in Australia, Tony, the first thing I'd have to say is that you have to realise that a certain amount of that news is going to happen. This is an important question. This is probably going to show my biases here, and apologise to any passionate Brexiteers. The UK has already done quite a lot of damage over the last few years to its brand on those things. And I do have a shout out for the guys at places like Visit Britain who have really done a great job at trying to minimise that and really to keep the focus on the things that people love about Britain and why. And I think they've managed to manage some of that, because again, I think it's worth remembering I am a news junkie, so I look at those things. The majority of people, it kind of may have chipped away at it, but I don't think it's going to change it compared to the compelling content. I think there will be some short-term damage, but it's going to depend on what happens next. And that's where I think it will change. At the moment, people might be thinking, well, am I going to be coming because there's a safety concern about whether the UK government has prepared for that. But if the UK government handles the next stage well, then I think they will be forgotten, because one of the things is now, without getting into whether people are right or wrong, it's much easier. Hindsight tends to confer 100% vision on what we should have done. Some of those decisions, I mean, I'll be honest and come out and say I completely called it wrong. I was very critical of the Australian government when they closed the border with China. I thought that was very damaging. I was totally wrong. But they had to take a decision, and they took it. I mean, maybe the UK didn't take decisions that they should have done, but I think you have to offset that against the clap for the NHS, which is an awesome piece of global branding, which originated, I think, in the UK. I think Italy and Spain and some of those guys have taken it on as well. But you stand out and see that, and it's on the news every week. And it speaks to things about Britain that are probably more important than the government, which is that the people are important on any destination. And it speaks to a sense of British resilience that I think is quite powerful. It also, for all the criticism of things, when you look at that, having those hero healthcare workers in the NHS, when people in the US are looking at, it's going to cost them $5,000 to get tested, that's a big inbound market. I think. So short answer, Tony, I'm aware I'm rambling a bit because I'm really thinking this through. I think there's a risk of short-term damage. It's going to depend on what happens next, but I think there are counter messages and messages that are more connected with what we're doing that should stand up against that in the longer run.
Right. Chris, any questions from your side?
I've got a good question. Yeah. Got a question from Stu here, which I think is interesting. Do you think the underlying motivations for travel will change as a result of COVID-19?
Yes and no. As I said, there's theories about the idea that we're always in different motivational states, but I always think I have a home state. And I'm going to go back to that cruise with my mum. I loved every single moment of the moment I spent with my mum and my sister, but I kind of felt like there was nothing left for me in that holiday. And I actually had to say to them, look, can we just do this one thing that's my thing? just so that I feel like, you know, it is my holiday too. I know it's got to be mum's holiday number one. I think our motivations to travel, I think connection will redial up, which is also good because domestic is where we're going to go first and reconnection sits to man. So I think that will dial up. I think safety will affect more people as a part of how they choose their destinations and their experiences. Feeling safe will be more important than, rather than just to that very cautious group. I think some of those cautiously extravagant group will look at safety, and as we saw, they're going to change the way they travel because they've thought this through. So I think those reassurance measures down at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs around the physiological needs and the safety and security are going to need to be a bigger part of what we do. But I think that they're going to have to be, there's still going to be permission unless you're a totally cautious traveler. You know, I've looked at all of these things where we've seen people kind of on plexiglass on beaches and stuff like that. And I'm kind of like, well, that's not going to, you know, I'm not so keen on safety that I'm going to lie on a beach with plexiglass around me. I'd rather go out for a walk at home. So I think we need to be making sure that we tick enough of those boxes. I'd say that's almost in a kind of reassurance piece alongside, but I would get people excited first, then have that helpful piece to say, here's how we're looking after your health. Have it fairly early in the process, but at the end of the day, you know, I'm not looking at that from a point of view of I'm not going somewhere that has, I'm looking at the Adelaide Hills because I was looking at the Adelaide Hills before COVID-19 hit. And I know that my dollars are going to do good there. In my case, because I sit more on that kind of right side of the map, I'm thinking about more of my bucket list things coming through. So I don't think we can only assume it's about safety and security. Maybe we felt life's a little bit more tenuous and precious, so maybe we'll see more people taking those dream trips. My backing, if I use Zoom, is Mungo National Park, and Jed and Chris and I have talked about this, which is somewhere I've been talking about going to Mungo for 10 years. I'm already waiting to try and see when I can go, because it's somewhere I've dreamed about going for a long time. It's safe because it's in the, you know, the Australian bubble, and it's fairly remote. I'll have to make sure I look after myself because it's a big Indigenous community and Indigenous communities are vulnerable. So I'm probably thinking more about those things, but it's dialed that up for me. So I don't think we can assume it's going to be all about safety and security. Really, none of us know. And, you know, it's a terrible tendency to fall into the guru trap here and try and say we know the answer to that. I think it will change it, but I don't think we can entirely predict all the ways that it will change. We just need to keep listening and paying attention. The real gurus here are the customers.
It's interesting though the way in which you almost feel that the consumer mindset is actually changing as we progress through the lockdown as well. You know, at first a lot of people were talking about, you know, people aren't going to want to travel, and now there's starting to be a feeling, and we've seen it on the Forward Keys data, and I've seen Kiwi data, which is similar, that actually there seems to be that feeling of, you know, actually once the world opens up, I'm going to travel like never before, because God forbid, you know, the next pandemic will be significantly worse. So therefore, I'm going to need to grab my opportunity while I can. So maybe we could see actually an even greater increased desire and demand for travel at the end of this, eh?
And it's interesting you say that, Jed, because we talked about, you remember that cycle of trends. I'm going to honestly say those cycles are shortening. Those cycles used to take 100, 200 years. Now they take 2 to 3. But we also see counter trends. And one of the things I always say to people is there's enormous opportunity. It's my third law of trends, is there are enormous opportunities in counter trends. If everyone else is charging that way and you're charging that way, there's probably money to be made because no one else is doing it. And I think at every stage of history, so we saw after World War I, we saw a desire for stability, but we also saw the explosion of hedonism. You know, people felt that life was so temporary that they had to live for the moment. The other thing I think that was a trend we saw long before COVID-19 was the changing of the meaning of travel in our lives. You know, 50 years ago, unless you were very wealthy, travel was a luxury. With each successive crisis, it's dipped because it's a higher good, it tends to get cut. But the point at which people cut it out of their lives, other than when they physically can't travel, like a pandemic, gets later and later and later. We saw that during the global financial crisis, that people were, they fought to hang on to their holidays and they sacrificed other things to keep them. We've moved from travel being a privilege to travel and being a right. Now that creates all sorts of problems like over tourism in normal times. But I think we need to be aware that the meaning of travel is going to change, and that's why we see that bounce back come back, like as you say, in the forward keys data and the travel set data and the Kiwi data, is because we haven't lost our love for travel. It hasn't, the meaning it has in our life, the extent to which we draw who we are from the travel we take, I think is particularly the more experiential end of travel. I think all of those things have meant that if we take away travel, we're taking away part of who we are. I mean, certainly for me, my travel is a big part of who I am. And if you take that from me, that there was actually a stage of almost bereavement. So you think of that classic cycle, we've moved through that. So I think we have to be aware of that changed meaning of travel and what we think about.
Maybe the 2020s are almost going to be like the new 60s. Yes. when we sort of came out of the war and everything was all about love and make the most of everything, and maybe that will be the 2020s. Maybe that's how we'll come out of this. Chris, any more questions from your side?
No, I'm just about done, to be honest with you, Jed. Have you got any?
Yeah, I've got a couple more, but I am very conscious of time as well. There's one from Mark Charette. Very good afternoon, evening to you, Mark.
Hello, Mark.
What are you finding is the biggest barrier to motivation for marketers inside businesses from changing and updating their strategy? Is it just old habits die hard, or is there something else we can tap into?
I think old habits die hard. And particularly at periods of stress, we do want to revert into new things, Mark, it's a great question, thank you. Which is why I've been fighting against that new normal, because that new normal, by definition, I think new normal is secretly hoping that we'll be able to bring some of the old normal with us. As I say, while we can't throw everything out and say nothing that we learnt in the past, I think we do need to be promoting that. Human beings don't really like change. We like habit, we like normality. So I think we are fighting, and again, that varies for different people. Some people love change, some people thrive on it, but on balance, on average, I think that the reason that marketers are like that is because marketers are like everyone else, and it's scary because the things that we used to know would work now no longer work. But what I'd actually say is, in some ways, this is the best of times to be trying that crazy stuff, because who's going to know if it went wrong? If it went wrong, who's going to know if it went wrong because it was a stupid idea, or if it went wrong just because the circumstances were wrong? Yeah. But if it goes well, oh my God, what a result you've got. So that's one of the other things I've been saying in that kind of, 50-60% of your build marketing, that's that long-term building. Do the crazy stuff, do the campaign that you could never get over the line normally, or the crazy marketing channel that you've always wanted to try, but you can never get it over because it wasn't as proven as the traditional ones, because we don't precisely know what's going to work in this new framework. So much has changed, other than holding in your place, well, what is the person there to do? And the reason I use that example, Mark will know, the guys at Mystic Link, because I know he's just up the road from them. The reason I really like that was that recognition that, if you're going out into social media going buy, you have to remember, as the guy said, 20% of your audience is reading you while they're sat on the toilet. And they're just not that into you. They're looking for entertainment while their mind, other parts of their body are doing something. Or they're looking to catch up with how their family in the UK, if I'm in social media, I'm looking for my family in the UK. Unless you're connecting with something that's in that mindset of entertaining me or giving me something, why would you think that's how you would start by selling to me? And I know Mark's work, Mark is a Google certified photographer. He helps people bring their experiences alive for people. So I actually think you're going to go well in this, Mark, because we're not going to be able to travel. So that virtual tour is going to work really well. But I think it is that fear of the unknown and well, I know this will work. Remember that quote I said about, people don't choose this because it's better. They choose it because they're more confident that it's good. That's why I think people are not changing, because we by nature favor what we know to be working over that. That loss aversion comes through. I mean, people won't even give away things that are costing them money when they could be offered something that costs them, that gives them more money, because we love what we have so much. So we need to be thinking about behavior change models to do that. And we need to be applying that to our discipline as marketers.
That's great, great point, Mark. Last question, I think,
I've got
before we will.
one more.
Go on.
I had a question here from Daniel. Partnerships. Is it a good time to combine strengths and assets to transition out of COVID-19 by forging partnerships and building strength?
Daniel, I think you know the answer to that yourself. All you're looking for me is to confirm it is at any time in tourism, the right partnerships are a great thing to do. 95% of tourism businesses around the world on average are, you know, in different countries, are small to medium enterprises. You almost certainly haven't got enough money to do what you want. And often the biggest problem, one of the things I like to say, I work a lot with regional destinations around the world. One of the things I like to say is your biggest problem is not whether they're staying in your hotel or the hotel next door. The biggest problem is not enough people are driving down that road. And partnerships are there. And we actually, years ago, some of the Inland New South Wales research that I shared earlier, we actually asked people what made them choose to go to certain regional areas. You know, and in Australia, a context to this is visiting a regional area is somewhere between 2 and 14 hours of driving, or, you know, several hours of flying. No one's going to do that for one experience unless it's Mona, the Museum of Old and New Art in Hobart is the exception that proves the rule. So finding the right partners to do stuff is to create that complexity. We know that clusters work. There's a reason why medieval streets, why London has a milk street where you bought your milk. There's a reason why London has a pudding lane, because that's where you went to buy your baking. It's because you knew you were going to get what you wanted, that certainty again. So the more that you can say to people by coming together and creating a cluster of experiences, could be a cluster of themed experiences. The Prosecco Road in Victoria's King Valley here in Australia, great example. Italian varietal wines. Focus on Prosecco, which was quite new in Australia at the time, creates a reason to go there. There's a blog piece on the mytravelresearch.com website, if you search for it, that talks about that. So I'm absolutely a believer in partnerships at any time, but in this time of needing to band together and looking for feeling part of that collective, that stabilized framework, I think partnerships are more important than ever.
I suppose, and to, you know, just to add to that, Carolyn, you know, that's what we are. You know, there's the World Tourism Association for Culture and Heritage, My Travel Research, Low Season Traveller. That's exactly what we've done, Daniel. You know, we've sort of, you know, come together in a spirit of collaboration. I think collaboration is absolutely essential for all of us to move forward. Yeah. Last question, Carolyn, if you don't mind, and I'm conscious of time. We've got so many in the audience still here. Thank you so much to everybody for sticking with us. We really appreciate it. This question, it's still early for me, guys. This question is from Dimitris in Greece. Countries need to come up with innovative ways to directly target and attract potential travellers. What could these be, given that conventional tourism expos and fairs are out of the question and collaborative promotions with OTAs, etc., proven to be too costly? And the reason I wanted to ask that question last is there's a little bit of a hint of a link to our next speaker on Tuesday, of course, Stu Spears, who's going to be talking more about events and expos. But what do you think, Carolyn? Is there any other innovative ways that we can come up with in the absence of the conventional tourism and expo fairs?
Well, the first thing I would say is if you found partnerships with OTAs were effective but too expensive for the ROI, I'd go back and negotiate right now, because I think that will be something that would be different. But definitely, and again, you know, maybe I think maybe I need to, Stu, can I unmute you so you maybe can join this discussion? I know you're self-muted, so if you wanted to unmute and join the discussion, Stu. Last thing I want, I'm happy to stand on the shoulders of Stu as a particular giant, but I'm very aware that he has more expertise. look, right now we're seeing people are getting used to the idea of virtual events. We're seeing our social space so I think that would be one way. And I think the other thing is tools like virtual reality and augmented reality, I think are great ways to be getting that out there. I don't know how many people follow David Matten of Trend Watching with his New World Same Humans, which I love as a name for a kind of narrative around this topic, because like I said, 50,000 years of the same frameworks, the way we make decisions. But he was talking about this. I mean, 10 years ago when Second Life came out, I thought this is how all tourist boards are going to promote in the future. But there's a new game called New Horizons, virtual reality game that you can play online, and apparently people are visiting tourism destinations in there. So I'd be going to talk to the games developers of that and trying to get your destinations in there, and giving people that virtual experience. And I'd also be exploring, in the context of over tourism, flight shaming, and the world that we're going to deal with once we've dealt with COVID-19 and the economic mix, I'd also be thinking, can we start monetizing that? People pay to go to a travel expo. I mean, some of them are free. I know we have a big travel expo here in Sydney, where I'm based, where it's free. But I've been to, I pay to go to wine shows, for example. Or you pay to go in, or you pay on the door. So people will pay to go to some of these things. So can we start to monetize the virtual reality experience rather than just give it away for free, which we all too want to do in tourism? So I think virtual events are ways to do it. I think it's interesting. There's been a lot of debate about whether we're now past the phase of using influencers. I think the big problem with that was we didn't know who influencers really were, because at the end of the day, influencers are just people who influence, and word of mouth is still part of that. So I think what we're now doing is we're moving beyond the phase where everyone gets terribly excited about influencers, waste a lot of money on influencers who don't help them do this, and start to sit down and think about doing that. So, if you're targeting family holidays, for example, Facebook mums groups, oh my God, this is an amazing way to generate conversation. Jed, I'm thinking your mum.
Yeah. All over Mumsnet, my wife is, and it's absolutely insanely good, she says.
Yes, and the level of engagement that you will get with that, and the interesting thing about those groups is, some of those people will want paying, particularly the savvy marketing mums in there. But if you look at who are those networks who's got good networks with the messages you want to do, not all of them want to be paid. Quite a lot of people, everything we share on social media about destinations, we do because the currency we're paying in is, this makes me look cool. So I'd be saying, look, maybe we don't need to do the big stuff. Maybe it's really at that level of doing something different. The other thing I'd probably say is, I've talked more at the kind of small scale digital marketing, ignoring those big studies at the beginning were all done about advertising. David Bierman in his session talked about how Visit Britain has got ads up, and this will link to, I guess, to Tony Hallwood's question as well, has got ads up for London all over the railway stations in Sydney. Now, it's not that a huge heap of people are traveling, but no one else is out there traveling, talking destination. So here's the thing, if you're that person on the train and suddenly there's no one else around you, you've got space to look around you, and you're going through station after station where you're seeing that kind of plucky British spirit, we're still out there, you're going to go home and talk about that. So I think that's where doing that, and again, that counter trend, if everyone else is pulling back from advertising, every dollar you spend has a much, much bigger effect. The marketing gurus talk about, they call it ESOV, excess share of voice, which is every dollar that you spend at this time above your share in the market, every single share of voice dollar you spend that contributes to your share of voice really delivers you a return, but it disappears very quickly when other people start to come back into advertising. So now is really that time to be getting out and targeting people and thinking about, my guess is right now there's an awful lot of media out there who will be prepared to talk to you about rates that they would have told you to go get stuffed a year ago.
Fair play. I noticed that we've got Stu has joined. Stu, did you have any thoughts on this? Hey Stu, can you hear us? No.
You're still self-muted, Stu.
No. Okay, no problem. I thought Stu might have been able to just give us a couple of insights, but obviously Stu will be joining us on Tuesday for the next
He's telling
session.
me I need to unmute him, but when I try, now I've unmuted
Oh,
you.
here we
now,
go.
Stu. Sorry, it was telling me I
There we go. Stu, welcome.
Thank you very much. Look, really briefly, in terms of expos, I tend to agree with Carolyn that it feels like virtual events feel like the way that things will move, whether that could be a mix between more curated expos, so it's not a cram fest as such. But when it comes to public-facing events, there's some really interesting models, which we'll touch on Tuesday night day in other parts of the world. Which are particularly in relation to cultural events. There are certain events out there, even before COVID hit, that were talking about self-guided cultural events and self-guided art events that were very much rooted in the place that event was actually taking place in. So when it comes to B2C events, there's some really interesting models which we'll touch on Tuesday.
Awesome. Really looking forward to the session on Tuesday as well, Stu. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Stu. And sorry, it was telling me initially you were self-muted, so I wasn't unclicking you, but I'm delighted you can join the conversation. So I probably should mention on that Stu and I first worked together on Vivid Sydney. So believe me, he knows his shit on events.
Very good. Carolyn, I think that is all we've got time for. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation and the in-depth Q&A. Thank you to everybody for all of the questions which we had. We've still got questions coming in, and unfortunately we can't get through all of them, but we really do appreciate it. I think we've got through most of them. I'd now like to hand over to Chris, who is, of course, the President and CEO of WeTAC, to provide us with his closing remarks, if you will, Chris.
Thanks, Jed. Yeah, I mean, really fascinating presentation. I always learn something from Carolyn, and it's quite interesting. I've known Carolyn for quite a number of years, and for the first part of our professional relationship, we used to meet in the city of Sydney and have coffee and discuss things, until one day we decided to meet in the inner west of Sydney. And it was only when we met in the inner west of Sydney that we found out that we're neighbors, and I could actually pass sugar over the fence. So I'm very fortunate that I get access to Carolyn's amazing mind, usually whenever I need it. So Carolyn, thank you absolutely so much for that. That was a lot of information to take in. But what we are going to do is we'll be putting the presentation online and the PowerPoint online, and you'll be able to use that. So Carolyn is very kindly sharing all of this information. On that note, it'll be on the WeTAC website. And on that note, I'd particularly like to thank all of our listeners today, particularly the members and the followers and the supporters of what we're trying to do in this crucial series. Really, without our members, we would find it probably difficult to survive as well. But the one thing that I took out of this, I mean, there was lots I took out, but there was just that one quote that said, "Be flexible for survival and agile for growth." And I think that is absolutely fantastic. I'll certainly be taking that away. So thank you again, Carolyn. And I'm seriously looking forward to Stu's session on Tuesday. Back over to you, Jed.
Thanks a million, Chris. So yeah, thanks again to everybody for joining us. Thanks to Carolyn again for sharing her expertise with us this week. We will be posting the webinar up online in the WeTAC group pages on LinkedIn and Facebook later this evening. And please do, as we said, join us for the 5th episode in this series next Tuesday, the 12th of May, where we'll hear from Stu Spears again in a little bit more detail. Stu, of course, is the owner and director of Silver Lining Strategy. And he's going to be talking to us about the 6 fundamentals for sustainable events. So please do join us for that, which is on next Tuesday. That's 1600 Sydney time, 1400 Singapore, 7 a.m. in London, 2 a.m. New York, 2300 on Wednesday. Is somebody trying to say something?
No, I was laughing, Jed. It's the way your voice changes when you say 7 a.m. London time.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's it's early in the morning. So look, final thanks again to all of our supporters. This series is hosted by me, Jed Brown of Low Season Traveller, and the producer is the talented, multi-talented Carolyn Childs of My Travel Research. Have a great day, a great evening, and a great morning, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you all next Tuesday.
Thank you, Jed.